and welcome to Psych Sessions, conversations about teaching and stuff. I'm Eric Landrum, along with Garth Neufeld, your podcast hosts. As the name implies, we center on conversations about teaching, but we often veer into other interesting topics, which is the end stuff. This is episode number 139, where Garth had the opportunity to interview Valerie Jones Taylor from Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Before you hear the interview, please allow me to share some listening tips and some of my favorite moments. This was a tremendous conversation that Valerie and Garth shared. So Valerie was a speaker at NITOP, and so was Garth, and they talked mostly about Valerie's research on interracial stereotyping processing. And her research involves prejudice and interracial interactions. And it is fascinating, it is relevant, and she has taken it in directions that are they're just relevant to today. And you really have to listen. I'm not a social psychologist, but she's using what appear to me cutting edge methodologies and resources to really examine things that are important today. For example, she talked about assessing meta-stereotypes. And these are what stereotypes I believe you will have about me. So I'm trying to use her words here so I get this exactly right, that I think you are going to see me stereotypically, so now I feel anxious behaving. And so when that happens, individuals are motivated to disprove the stereotype. And she gives some great examples talking to Garth. Garth asked her about where she gets this interest in doing this work, and it goes all the way back to her first experiment as an honors thesis student. She did actually talk a little bit about her undergraduate studies at UT Austin and then a graduate student at Stanford, a double major as an undergraduate in psychology and ethnic studies, and listen to her list of advisors: Claude Steele, Hazel Marcus, Jennifer Eberhardt. I mean, that is an amazing group of people to be able to have be your mentors. I mean, what a lovely trio of individuals. Valerie spent most of her time talking about not only her classes that she teaches in social psychology, but also kind of the methodology that bridges her teaching and her research. And her talk at NITOP included work on the fictional and virtual worlds, how to teach these tough topics. And what was really innovative is that she talked about a comic strip assignment that is pretty involved. And so it replaces what traditionally was a written midterm for her. And it has to be about a difficult, it's a topic related to race, because that's what the course is about, or that's what the main topic of that assignment is about. And it's something that she's perfected over years. And I really enjoyed listening to that aspect of it, because I think if you've been teaching for a while, you've probably got at least one assignment in one course that you've kind of used over time, but you've tweaked it, you've gotten feedback, something new happened, you made it better, and you could tell that's what Valerie has done with this. And so she has them create a complicated 25 panels or so comic strip. They use a certain type of software. Artistic students love it. And so she gave an example that she talked about where students using citations talked about maternal health outcomes differing by race and mortality. And imagine having to do that in such a way where you communicate that in a clear way in comics. And so what a lovely way to get students to translate their psychological science knowledge into a format that could be understood by citizens. And that is a skill as psychology educators understand. The other piece of this that Valerie goes into, and I'm not doing it justice, you really have to listen to her talk about it in her own words, is that another line of research that actually makes it into her classroom quite nicely is the undoing of racism, where there are researchers in social psychology who study intervention effects. For example, the effect of effectiveness of interracial friendships, or trying to dismantle systemic racism, or intergroup contact theory. And so how do you put people together? Well, in 2022, that could be, somewhat volatile. But she's found a way, along with other researchers, to optimize virtual reality. So she's been doing things in her lab and in collaboration with others that you can get some perspective taking, where you can get, for example, undergraduates either in a class or in a laboratory study to walk through the experience of someone who's homeless and have this embodied experience. And then you can ask them about their attitudes toward the homeless 6 to 8 weeks out and look at their short-term and long-term attitude changes about homelessness. There's also been research about this using the VR technology with refugee experiences and attitudes, abortion clinics. And she does talk about the ethical implications of stepping into someone's shoes. The activities that she uses in classes, the importance of the debriefing process. It was just a lovely chat to listen in on, and to see and hear about Valerie's ability to mesh her teaching and her research, and have her to see her ability to bring topics that are so relevant to all of us today, and to be able to present the psychological science to all of us.
Listeners, we want to invite you to be among the first to know who and what's coming up on the Psych Sessions podcast. Join our opt-in email list, just like hundreds of psychology instructors have already done. We promise not to fill your inboxes. When we email you bi-weekly or monthly, it will be something that means something. From new series announcements to new opportunities, we invite you to join the mission to get free, high-quality professional development to all teachers of psychology. So sign up for our opt-in email list. Just go to bit.ly/psych sessions-email. That's all lowercase, bit.ly/psych sessions-email. I am so excited to be here today with Valerie Jones Taylor from Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. How'd I do?
That was perfect.
Oh, very good. Very good. And not hyphenated.
Not hyphenated.
Jones Taylor, not hyphenated. Thanks for doing this on such short notice, too. And I know I kind of just cornered you. I'm like, can I interview you? But we had dinner last night with some friends of ours, and I happened to be there, and you happened to be there. And I was listening to you talk. I'm like, you are going to be a perfect guest for the podcast. So thanks for doing that. How has your NITOP been so far?
It's been great. I love talking about teaching. Yep. I enjoy teaching, and really thinking about ways that my research can enhance my teaching and vice versa.
Okay.
So I love them both.
What are you working on right now? What are you researching?
So my main area is stereotyping and prejudice broadly, but in particular, I'm interested in interracial interaction processes, what makes them go well and what makes them fall apart. And I think about it from a social identity threat perspective, what concerns or worries people may have in the context of interracial interactions, novel interactions, particularly those that bring up difficult, tough topics, race-related topics, controversial, quote-unquote, controversial topics, and how we manage those things in interpersonal interactions, or don't manage those things.
Are you really good just personally at just being calm when awkward, weird situations are going on?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Recently I've been thinking about, I've been watching Curb Your Enthusiasm, which and the main character on it, Larry David, he's just okay with any kind of awkwardness, right? He makes the awkwardness. But I think what is that trait in people? I'm not saying that you're like Larry David, by the way, but what is that trait in people that can just sit with it and not completely freak out? I'm guessing it happens in this research, right?
It happens in the research and in my daily life. So
right.
Where people say a lot of interesting things.
Oh, yeah.
So
Now I'm recalling a story you told even just on the way here from the airport. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I know that's not just for people of color. When we have different identities that are sort of raised in different contexts, those things can occur. But it was salient. And those things happen in interracial interactions. That's one of the hallmarks.
Oh my gosh.
That anxiety and stress.
You couldn't have written that better for what you research. And I'm sorry that happened. It sucks, right?
It was just a really salient thing that just happened and sort of relates to the work that I do and reminds me why it's so important to do the work that I do. Helps me remember why confronting or how confronting is hard, how you take a risk, how that risk is not always received well, and sort of the backlash to those risks and how that varies based on your positionality, your background.
When you're in a moment like that, are you thinking are you leaning on what you know about this in order to react, right? But you didn't lose it on this person.
I wanted to. But I did not.
That sounded so good in my headphones.
I think most people's initial reaction is emotional. And then you have to self-monitor to get to the more measured response. And I think about it when we think about implicit bias and other things, how, especially when we think about, I teach social psychology, so we talk about system 1 versus system 2 processing and all this, and how some of those gut responses can come quite naturally, for better or for worse. And sometimes that first response, though natural, has to be dealt with and managed, right? If you have the time, the energy, the space, etc. And it can take some time to get there, right? But if we have the resources, emotional, social, physical resources to cope, it behooves us to try to do that, no matter what the issue is. If we're responding, if we feel we've been accused of being racist, right? Or if we feel we've been the target of racism, etc., either side of the fence, that gut response will rise up. But our ability to sort of deliberatively kind of respond is important. And there are different stresses that we have that make getting there easier or harder in any given moment. And so I just think, when I think and talk to my students about it, to be conscious of that entire space, is really important, and to remember how important those deliberative processes are to sort of move the needle on many of these issues, and don't get stuck in our first gut response where it can lead us to sort of shrink back and not deal with things. Now, there are times we don't have to deal with things. We are not required. Yeah. Especially if you belong to groups that always have to deal with things. You don't have to always deal with things. So that's why I say if you have sort of those emotional resources to cope. And I look at some of that actually in my research, thinking about those resources.
I have a feeling that you've asked some pretty interesting research questions. And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but off the top of your head, can you tell us about a study you've done, a question that you've asked?
Yeah. So one of my larger questions for the past few years in the world of interracial interactions was thinking about how one responds to witnessing a member of their racial or ethnic group behaving stereotypically in the context of an interracial interaction. And it sounds kind of complex, but we see it all the time. And so the few examples I often give to make it hit home, and in my talks, I give 2 video examples. One is from The Office, where Michael is doing Diversity Day. Many people have seen this clip of Diversity Day, and he is acting like Chris Rock, the comedian, and being kind of offensive. Well, he is being offensive, and everybody in the room is embarrassed, like they're looking down. And what I'm interested in really are the other white people in the room, how they are understanding what Michael is doing, and then how that impacts their relationship with other people in the room, particularly people of color. right? The Black people. So Stanley, I think, is the Black man in the room. That's one example. This happens a lot. It's happened to me before I remember I was at the doctor's office, and I think Trump was newly elected at the time, and the TV was on. A woman came in, sat near me, and then something was happening, and whatever clip it was, it, caught Trump saying something that would likely be offensive to many. And she looked at me and she was like, oh my gosh, this is like, I would never say something like this. And so, and she kind of went on talking about that. And it reminded me of sort of the responses that people have written about in the context of interracial interactions. And one includes overcompensation for the behavior of, the stereotypes of your group. And the stereotype there was a white person being prejudiced or racially insensitive, right? That's one of the largest stereotypes that we've seen over and over in research among white Americans. On the reverse side, I've seen myself and students in class, they may be African American, and another student makes a really egregious mistake and they are Black. And then they fear that others will see them similarly. So I'm really interested in the metacognitive processes that people feel when they witness something like that. And then how it impacts their ability to work in a group with a diverse group of students or majority white students at the institution they are. How they may really feel like they have to show up 110% in that class, sort of this pressure to work harder. Or in one instances, they may freeze, they may overcompensate, they may avoid, or they may be sort of angry. So those are sort of the range of responses that I've been interested in. So I've done studies, survey studies, laboratory studies with Confederates and other things, and correlational longitudinal studies with ethnic minority students to look at that phenomenon and sort to try to look at the landscape of responses in interracial interactions.
Yeah. What are by the way, fascinating research. And I think it must be so much fun to be able to create those lab experiences or those experiences with Confederates.
Fun and difficult.
Yeah.
Really difficult. But almost like you're in a theater on an actor's stage. I mean, that's why I sort of fell in love with social psychology. I was really interested in some of the original experiments that looked at naturalistic behavior and tried to figure out how to capture it in a bottle in a laboratory and then extrapolate back out. So the push and pull between internal and external validity is hard, but something I've always been really interested in as well.
Okay. So you mentioned a couple of scenarios a few minutes ago, and that was when if maybe white people are kind of accused of being racist, and then you used another one. I can't remember what it was, but are those some of the scenarios that you set up? And you ask people how would you feel if you were accused of that?
We have them either imagine a situation where that's happening in a particular context. We actually do the situation in a laboratory context through manipulating Twitter feeds by other students, etc. And then they have to interact with a Black student or something like that. We have them retrospectively remember real life instances where this has happened and then rate their emotional, behavioral, cognitive responses. So I've done it in all of these different ways. And we see that one of the predominant responses are that, there's a chain. We really feel that we will be perceived in line with those stereotypes. So we assess meta-stereotypes. The stereotypes I feel you will have about me because of what we witnessed. That's why it's meta.
Okay, yeah.
So I love that. And we theorize that as really the linchpin that begins the process, the cascading process down. So from there, it seems to be you have this cognitive response. I think they're going to see me stereotypically. Oh my gosh, that's the emotion. I'm embarrassed or I'm overwhelmed or I feel really anxious now to interact with other people who have likely witnessed this also. And from there, you have those anticipatory behavioral responses or the actual behaviors if we can capture it in the lab. And often we see people really feeling motivated to disprove the stereotype, which can be taxing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. When did you get really curious about this stuff? You mentioned the beginning of like Trump's term. Was it like, how long have you been asking these kinds of questions?
The Psych Sessions podcast is sponsored by Macmillan Learning. Macmillan Learning's Achieve for Psychology, setting a whole new standard for integrating assessments, activities, and analytics into your teaching. One way Achieve does this is by offering exclusive digital activities for each title, created by or under their direction. These immersive learning activities, each accompanied by assessments, engages students in the very essence of contemporary psychology as they role-play as researchers, work with data, and learn how to think like scientists. Tell us what you think. See a preview and get involved at macmillanlearning.com/psych sessions. Macmillan's Achieve for Psychology, engaging every student, supporting every instructor, setting the new standard for teaching and learning.
Wow, I've been interested in it actually since undergrad.
Okay.
Since undergrad, yeah. I did my first experiment as a thesis student, honors thesis student. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I was really interested. It's interesting how things come full circle. Like you're interested in something so long ago, and then you kind of come back to it later. I remember I did an honors thesis where at the time I was really interested in rap videos and how the either exploitative videos of Black women would make Black women feel when they were like interacting with other Black women versus white women or not. Like I was interested in all these things and how it would impact their emotions, their mood, their identity, Black identity. And so I tried to put together an experiment to sort of look at that. And,
that's not that far off of what you're doing,
no,
right?
It is.
Like,
I kind of came full circle.
That's amazing.
So that's really where I began really thinking about it. So I've really been interested in interracial interactions for a long time. When I went to grad school, I focused more heavily on social identity threat, stereotype threat in particular, and the seeds of that idea feeling pressure to work harder. So I was interested in sort of the flip side of thinking about how stereotypes might undermine one's performance. In what situations could it actually motivate people to push and work harder, which could, in the short term, make you look like you're doing better, but maybe lead to burnout or, more negative outcomes over time. That was a hard thing to look at, but that's where it's kind of started. And then moving on to my postdoc and into my career, I pulled everything together. Yeah. And that's where I am now. Yeah. Finally.
A lot of things that psychologists study are not things that they have to experience all the time, right? And maybe this happens more in social. Well, I don't know. I got to think through that. But you're very close to your research. I mean, that's how we kind of started, is with this story of experiencing it. But how do you think about that separation between... Yeah, because you're researching a phenomenon that you are experiencing all the time.
Yeah, I think,
or we all are.
It's interesting because a lot of psychologists could be accused of my research is my me search, and that's done or said derogatory. It's a derogatory way in which people are saying that. But I want to remind, people that a lot of the backbone of social psychology was actually looking out into the real world and seeing what was going on. So the beginnings of psychology was really trying to understand what would cause a thing like Nazi Germany to ever exist. And Lewin and other folk at the time really were trying to understand, was it a prejudiced personality? Yeah. Was it evil, intention? Like all these sorts of personality factors, then social factors, then systemic factors, then back to cognitive factors. Like these are the different movements in social psychology to try to understand these phenomena. And it is, some people may quote unquote live aspects of it more than others given their positionality, but we all do. Yeah. We all do. It just is easier for some of us to try to separate ourselves from it if we're not implicating ourselves on one side of the fence or the other. So you understand what I'm saying?
I do.
And so I just remind people that we're all living this.
Yeah.
It's important to study it. But I have to acknowledge that some of my personal experiences represent an N of one, and that's why the research is important.
Yeah.
So you do the research, right? To get beyond me search. The idea could come from your lived experience, but to be able to generalize and to extrapolate, you have to try to formulate the theory, hypotheses, test them, etc. And so I see no issues with that. If you are working hard to look at the boundary conditions, etc., to understand these phenomena.
So you start studying this in undergrad. Where did you do undergrad, by the way?
University of Texas at Austin.
Oh, you're Longhorn.
I am.
And then grad school was Stanford, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I want to go two places right now. Let me go to this place first. So you've been studying this for a long time, and it's always been, I mean, you can disagree with me. If you think I'm wrong about something, just disagree with me. That's fine. But this has always been something that people have been experiencing, right? Or for like our entire lives, right? And then 7 years ago, everything just gets turned up, right? Culturally, just everything in the United States gets a little louder. As far as the divide, it's just in our face all the time. How have you thought about that from kind of a research perspective? And would you agree with me that it's always been there? It's just now we are much more aware of it.
Yes. So I think it's interesting for me because in undergrad, I was actually a double major. I majored in psychology and in ethnic studies with a concentration in African and African American studies. And so I've always understood the history because I took a lot of history courses, African American education courses, literature courses to fulfill my double major. And so the events just are never surprising, unfortunately. Yeah. I hate to say it that way, but they're never surprising to me. It is sad. They are sad, excuse me. But if you understand the history, you can easily see how some of these things could play out in this way. You would hope that they wouldn't, but history isn't well taught in this country and or feared in this country. So a lot of us are super surprised when you see quote unquote history repeating itself. Yeah. I just think about my, some of the things my mother grew up in segregated Louisiana, and some of the things she really had never told me. Some older Black people in America don't talk about it a lot. It's trauma, right? But after George Floyd, we were kind of discussing some things. She had just told me things I had never heard before about what she experienced, what her mother experienced. And this is like in the 60s, right? So again, many people's lifetime. And it's just hard to believe that some of the things that happened to them aren't the same exact things aren't happening, but the thoughts, the transformation of how to maybe subjugate or oppress certain people looks different, but the goals are still the same, And while we like to say that so much has changed, a lot of attitudes are still similar. And it's really, it's often hard, I notice, for some students, especially like in the last 10 years, to really understand like what happened. They grew up with Obama being the president and people saying that our world is post-racial, and then all these things happened, and a lot of them are really upset and angry, and that runs the fence across racial, ethnic background, right? A lot of people are really confused. And I think that's a failure of, our education system to I dare I say, withhold some of that information, not to make anyone feel bad, but just to be honest. Yeah. So we can move forward and like deal with it. And so I just enjoy in the research, I say enjoy tongue in cheek, just thinking through these problems and how from an interpersonal, because I'm really interested in the interpersonal factors, how those processes then can filter up, sort of a bottom-up effect, to more systemic issues and vice versa, thinking about that. It's really hard to do, but I'm really interested and committed to trying.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have colleagues nationally that you work with, or do you have colleagues in the department that you work with on these questions?
Yes. Should I name?
No, you
Okay.
can. You can. Or...
Yeah. I've worked really closely with a woman named Caitlin Yantis. We work together on a lot of these projects. She's now at Franklin and Marshall as a visiting assistant professor. Hi, Caitlin. And my colleague, Courtney Bonham, who's at UC Santa Cruz, who has we went to grad school together and we work very closely together on this and really great work she does on, quote, race and space, physical space, how spaces are racialized and how that impacts our treatment and our perceptions of different physical spaces, which is really important. And Nicole Shelton, my postdoc mentor at Princeton, who really got me thinking hard about interracial interaction processes. Her and Jennifer Richardson in social psych really blazed the trail for all of this research. And so she's been, a huge supporter and mentor and advocate. And of course, my advisors, Claude Steele and Hazel Marcus, in particular, Jennifer Eberhardt, who I've worked with to think through all of these things over the years and really sort of pushed myself.
Wow. That's quite a list of folks. Now, I was just curious when you were saying that. I think Claude was the only male in that list. Do you think that this just represents psychologists, or are more women studying this than men?
I've not thought hard about that. I interact with men who do it.
Oh, okay.
I just, I didn't say their name. I'm not collaborating with them.
No,
yeah.
No, that's fine. It was
let me say that.
Just a question.
But I do think it may lean more women as the field has begun to lean a little more, like maybe 60-40. I don't know what the percentage is. Yeah. So it would probably be fair to say so.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's a good question.
Who knows? So you gave an invited talk here at NITOP, and what was your talk on? Was it related to your research?
Yes.
Well, and let's just tell people why I don't know, because you and I, we're doing concurrent sessions, and so at NITOP you speak twice, and you and I got slotted for the exact same times twice, so we can't see each other.
I was pretty bummed.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, okay. So what was your talk about?
So it was a crazy long title, so I shall not repeat it here. Bad choice. But the Cliff Notes version was blah, 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 quote, fictional and virtual worlds, how to incorporate particular assignments to teach tough topics in social psych. Experiential learning, blah, blah, blah. So all this stuff. So I teach a series of top courses, usually intro social psychology. I've designed a seminar for psychology cross-listed with Africana studies called The Doing and Undoing of Racism. From a historical, legal, and social psychological perspective, I teach a grad course, The Psychology of Racism. I've taught statistics, univariate, multivariate in the past, and really try to incorporate a lot of the research into the statistics when I teach those courses, just to make it interesting for students who really check out or absolutely hate statistics. We all know, all statistics professors know this pain. So I always try to keep my teaching sort of close to the research and vice versa. So in this talk, I really have been thinking a lot about, obviously, interracial interaction processes. And what we know from the research is that a lot of things can go poorly. We've sort of documented, well, the stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination processes, etc. But there's this other hugely influential theory that we love to talk about, intergroup contact theory by Gordon Alport, 1950s. And it's a very straightforward theory. When you get people of different social backgrounds together, people's prejudice should be reduced. The interaction between them over time, right, should reduce one's prejudice. There are boundary conditions that hold this up. There have been many studies, mostly correlational, but many studies, because it's sort of hard to study this phenomenon in the field. You can't randomly assign people to interact and not interact with people, right, all the time, so that's hard to do. But there seems to be pretty strong evidence that when you get people from different groups together, it will reduce one's anxiety for interacting with people of different backgrounds, somewhat decrease their prejudice, and improve their perspective taking or empathy, all in the service of reducing their prejudice. So these things sort of sit in conflict almost, or paradoxically live in the same universe. And I've been thinking a lot about that. Other researchers have also thought about this and begun to write about this. And I was thinking, not only in my research, but in my teaching, that means that things could go really bad in the classroom if I'm teaching some of these tough topics and it's interracial, interethnic, but then it could go really good because they're interacting and we're talking about these so you understand? Yeah. So I've been wrestling with that and just doing a lot of the reading and some of my own work, some work by Liz Page Gould and others, really, and Linda Trop, etc., have got us to think about sort of the time course of interactions. Almost like in the short term, things could often go really badly, especially if there's novel interactions when you don't know people well, etc. But substantive, long-term interracial contact, interethnic contact, we really can begin to see the benefits of that. We see that in the context of interracial friendships, interracial romantic relationships, etc. We see people marry folks across different backgrounds, and then their families' attitudes begin to change, right? So their extended contact, virtual contact, interacting with people online, like all these sorts of things. And I really became interested in how these insights can inform how we teach. And so that's really what that talk, the long way of saying kind of what that talk
it's really helpful, actually.
Is about. And so I began to introduce two assignments or activities and assignments to really help that. So I give the case study in my Doing and Undoing of Racism class. It's a 2-part class. The first half, before spring break, I always teach it in the spring. We talk about some of the historical, legal, different things that sort of undergird racism in this particular country. And then we spend the rest of the first half of the semester really talking about the ABCs of prejudice, the affective components, behavioral components, discrimination, affective prejudice, cognitive stereotyping. So we talk about all of that, read a bunch of studies, learn about the history, implicit bias, what's all this stuff. We're really down at the mid-semester. And students are, they're fired up, but it can feel really heavy and really hard, even though they sort of came in wanting to be able to have a better facility with this. So I started to replace the midterm paper with a comic strip midterm. And so that's one of the activities I talked about. And the requirements are really to document historical and or social psychological process that has contributed to prejudice, racism, discrimination, something. I don't make it doesn't have to be about racism, just some ism that we have studied in social psychology. And so they do the storyboard. We sort of walk through it. There's rules and regulations, right, on how to do it. And they have to have different characters. They have to have good dialogue. They have to cite primary articles that we've read. If they want to talk about implicit bias, they have to show me where they've sort of either pictorially or in the text of the characters demonstrated these processes. And it has to be at least 20 to 35 panels. Mm-hmm. And so there's different software we use to do that. that allow for great flexibility in the backgrounds, the props, the facial expressions, the dialogue, techniques, and all that. And the students love it. They think they're just going to enjoy. I mean, they do enjoy it, but they don't realize just how hard it is. I actually think it's harder than the midterm paper, because the midterm paper was sort of cataloging and sort of responding to these different types of processes and how we want to think about it, etc. But this, they have to have an idea, have characters sort of and walk through some process, and it has to be clear what they're demonstrating. I like it because it forces them to have greater facility with the topic that they're talking about, because they have to represent it in a way that a lay person can understand the process. And that's harder than doing a research paper using the jargon that they've learned. Like, how would your sister, or your younger brother, or your grandmother, or your parents, or people who don't know anything, or even disagree with some of your thoughts, how would they read this?
Yeah, I love it. And it also gives them this skill that they're going to leave your class with. How did you think about that? How did you come up with that? You don't know?
How did I come up with that? Oh, I remember. So before I was at Lehigh University, I taught at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, which was a wonderful experience. And one of my colleagues used a cartoon version to do, I forget what class it was in, but she had them do a few panels. And I thought, how can I incorporate this in my course, really to teach these tough topics that we need to learn how to explain better, clearer, and simply to people. And lo and behold, racism is one of them, or things associated with it, processes associated with it. So I have worked a number of years to sort of perfect this assignment, and we workshop it. We have the students workshop it in class. That's a really good activity, because they realize that it's not a night before assignment like you might have thought it was. Oh, I can just put together a little cartoon. No, you have to be really thoughtful to do this well. And when you have someone else read it, they don't understand what is going on. Like, they look at the images or the dialogue, they have no clue. So the revision process is really important, and it teaches them the importance of revision as well. Our students have trouble with that, revising their work or wanting to revise their work. So it helps with that. And then they feel really confident and proud of their work at the end, because they feel that they have been able to describe something, more simply. That's a very complex topic. And they've gotten to use a different part of their brain. My artistic students love it. They're like, I never do things like this. Yeah. So for all of those reasons, it's been a hit.
Yeah. What's can you give us an example of one that a student did?
Yes. Yeah. It's one I give in the presentation. So I had one student, and I allow them to pick a topic of their interest. She was really interested in maternal health outcomes that differ by race, in particular Black and white women, and mortality of women, etc., during their childbearing years, or when they're pregnant, So she thought of this idea where she would walk through the lives of a Black and a white woman of different socioeconomic backgrounds. And so I made sure, you cite this for me, where you can find that the research or the literature suggests that even a Black woman of a higher socioeconomic status will have higher mortality rates at childbirth than a white woman of a lower economic status, and why that may be the case, and sort of walking through that idea. And what social psychological process could you use to demonstrate part of the issue, right? Of course, she couldn't talk about all of it. So,
it's so complex, right?
It is.
And now I'm starting to understand the value of this assignment, because you can't go in 10 different directions. You really have to figure out what you want to say and tell that particular story and that thread of that story.
Yeah. So we'd read a series of articles in the first half of the semester, again, the doing of racism, on implicit bias in the medical field. And there are a number of really good articles that were looking at social context, networks, implicit bias, the doctor-patient relationship, and all of these other social psychological things as well. And she was able to layer in some of those processes with the interactions that the white woman versus the black woman and the black woman were having with their doctor, the same doctor, how their partner was or was not involved, and get to the end. Unfortunately, the black woman after childbirth was describing her discomfort, her pain, kind of wasn't taken seriously by the doctor. And that conversation, we saw that kind of walked out in a few panels versus the conversation with the white woman. And then at the end, unfortunately, one did not make it, to say that. So it was difficult. Her interest, she was interested in the medical field. As a student in my class, it was really hard for her to do it. And I, required her to stay very close to the literature and or the lived experiences of people that she'd read. And I required them to cite 3 to 4 primary sources and indicate that for me on various panels where they thought they were targeting this process or that process. And she just did a wonderful job, way better than some of her writing or posts. Yeah. This allowed me to see what was really in her.
Yeah.
And how strong of a student she really was.
I suspect that when you're having students create their storyboards and stuff too, that it's probably pretty energizing for you as a teacher to see these cool ideas come, and you just get to kind of give your 2 cents every once in a while, right? And guide them in that good direction. I mean, it just sounds like it would be, it'd be fun, a fun class to teach for those weeks. How long does this process go?
I do it for about 3 or 4 weeks to let them get through it because it's not easy. Yeah. But I've also used it in classes that aren't so quote unquote heavy. Yep. So I've also used it in my social psychology intro class, which is 100 plus students. And there they take some of the more difficult social psychological concepts that they always confuse, like upward and downward social comparisons or counterfactuals, things like that. I make them in a small pod or a group, put together a series of cartoons where they're attempting to explain these processes as well. So I've used it as both the large bang assignment midterm or some of these shorter, more low stakes assignments. So it's worked well in both, and the students really appreciate it.
How do you grade that individual assignment? And how many students are in that class?
No more than 19. So it's a small class seminar.
And then you must be really familiar with the work before you actually grade it, right?
I've seen it a few times. I don't require them to submit a draft, but many do. And of course, I make them tell me what they're doing, and we do have a few conversations. So I've done a lot of work, and there's a lot of resources online, and I've put together a rubric which sort of goes through 7 categories, beginning with some sort of the basic features that are required, how many panels, etc.
Yeah.
And then they are required. The 2 really important categories for the assignment are clearly detailing the social psychological and or historical process and the story theme. So the rise and fall of the action, because it is a story that they're telling in the cartoon. And that has to connect with that process. So those are the 2 big components that I've sort of broken up into the different levels to evaluate in the rubric. But also the other categories are the characters, the landscapes or the scenery that they include, the captions and the text associated with the ideas. And there's a few others like that. So it's worked well. And I've had the students, the first time I did it, I really had the students look at it and help me to tweak it. I like that. They feel like they have a lot of voice in it. And of course, we know that students love to see the rubric before they're graded. Yeah. So I really try to do that, like give it to them up front, no surprises on the back end, so they know how they're being graded. And if they allow me to do the draft, they usually will do pretty well if they've been allowed to revise. If not, But
Right.
it's good though. It usually goes pretty well.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. So, which program do your students use to make these comics?
I use Pixon.
PI.
Pixton.edu, I believe.
Okay.
It's not too expensive at all. It's less than $150 a year, I believe.
Okay.
And you can set up classrooms and send links out to students, or they can log on with registered email addresses, and it creates a classroom. They create their own avatar. I like it because the avatar options are pretty diverse.
Mm.
They have, varying hair types, skin tones, facial features, and outfits, hats, hijab, all kinds of things, right? So that's nice.
Yeah.
The one thing I think they need to work on is body size, right? So I think that's not as good as it could be, but other categories seem to be okay generally. And of course you're cartoony, but people get pretty close. It's pretty cute. And what I like about it is after everyone creates their avatar, it puts us in a classroom, and I take a snapshot of the classroom and put it on the top of the LMS, the learning management system, and they see our class picture in avatar form at the top. And then they can use themselves in their cartoon or create additional characters. And with the license, you have like maximum flexibility to pick all sorts of, it's
so you as an educator buy the license or an institution or whatever, but students can then use it under that license.
Yeah.
And it's $150 a year or something.
Or less, something like that. But there are many different ones. This is the one I landed on.
Yeah.
But there are a number of other ones. And quite frankly, you can require students to do this on pen and paper with pencil.
Sure.
If that's how you want to go. I do require them to start that way. Like draw it out for yourself so you can erase and sort of think, and then transfer it. The other thing is the software will truncate how much text you can put on any given
I love that.
strip. I love it
so
too.
So good. Yes.
Because I tell them, this is a lesson in brevity. Like, how can you get your point across? Well, in a short number of characters, that tweet that you guys love, etc. But really be clear. And if you need a few panels to do it, do it. And so how to think through that process. So it really works well. And that tends to be one thing they note on the evaluations, how they really enjoyed the activity, appreciated it. It was sort of different, but not necessarily easier, if you pitch it the right way and don't let them wait to the last minute.
Yeah. So is that the second? That's not the entire second half of that course, though, right? Then you go into
the second half of the course. I go into the quote undoing of racism, and the point of that half is to talk about the various social psychological interventions that people have put forth or tested to attempt to undo the effects of racism. So it talks about perspective taking, intergroup contact theory, interracial friendships, and just kind of runs the sort of laundry list, quote unquote, of things and how they work together, how they work apart, the pros and cons of them. Are they effective only intrapsychically, interpersonally, systemically? Where do they fall apart? And so we critique these. And at the end of the course, they're required to write a paper. They can choose. I allow them to choose, especially during COVID. I didn't want to force one thing or the other. They could choose to compare and contrast 3 of the interventions and sort of walk us through with evidence from the literature about why they work or what's the pros and cons of each. Or they could design a novel intervention to, quote, undo racism.
Wow. That sounds like a really cool class. Did you design the whole class?
I did. It was wonderful. It was exciting.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about, I want to teach it a little differently. I start teaching it in January.
Yeah.
Late January. And I kind of want to design it a little differently as times change. So I've been thinking about maybe alternative ways, especially now that we've been thinking more about systems, how to perhaps, I think my new idea is thinking about the doing and undoing of racism from an intrapersonal, interpersonal, and systemic level. And so just organizing the readings and the weeks a little bit differently to sort of walk back and forth through those processes to be very clear that all of them are important, but at what moment may one level be more important than the other and why, and so sort of thinking critically through that, because we know right now people are talking a lot more about systemic racism and how do we address or meet the moment as social psychologists who think about intrapsychic and interpersonal forms of racism, right? And so I think that's would be very helpful and important for the students to think more about.
Yeah. Well, I know I told you about an hour, and so I want to honor that. And so we've got just a few minutes left, but I do want to.
I have to tell you about the other thing in my talk.
Oh, there's more.
There's more.
Well, then let's go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because this is the part I'm actually most excited about.
It all built to this.
Yes.
Okay.
So again, the talk is fictional worlds and virtual worlds and how we use this. So that's the first part. And then the second part, when we're talking about the undoing of racism, I've been thinking more about virtual reality and how we use virtual reality as a technological tool to think about undoing these systems of racism, etc., or other isms. And that's really exciting because there is this work on embodiment in VR where you, quote unquote, step into the shoes of another person very momentarily, very briefly, and you may experience a few things that they might experience. And when we talk about perspective taking in particular and empathy as things to think about in undoing racism, I have them walk through a series of virtual reality simulations that have attempted to do this in the literature. And so I talked about a few. One is called Becoming Homeless, where you sort of walk through the experience of a person who has become homeless. You are that person, and it takes you through various stages. I have to give a plug to Jeremy Bailenson, who is the creator of this simulation. And there's been research that has shown, and I have the students read the associated article that shows that when people are randomly assigned to this condition versus just reading about taking on the perspective or thinking about a person versus watching a 2D video and all sorts of other things, really having this experience, this embodied experience, improves people's attitudes towards the homeless, opens up their mind in all sorts of ways, and actually seems to have longer lasting effects for real things like signing a petition or other behavioral outcomes 6 to 8 weeks out. And they're still sort of looking at further out, as I speak. And so I have them do that one. Another one by our colleague, she's a psychologist as well, Courtney Cogburn, called 1,000 Cut Journey. And you walk through the life of a little Black boy whose name is Michael. He experiences different really difficult racial interactions, starting as a child in kindergarten through high school. It kind of ends with a difficult experience with the police. And you have a moment to sort of think about that. And we do many others. We do ones with refugee experiences, people who are going to an abortion clinic, like all these, it kind of varies, like the different ways I have them engage, just to have them think for a moment about what this experience may be like. But we talk very critically about the ethical implications of, quote unquote, stepping into the shoes of someone else, even for a brief amount of time, the potentially voyeuristic challenges of of what this may mean, and also the outcomes that researchers have found by doing this and the long lasting or short lived effects of this. And it's just been a powerful way. So it's not an assignment, but there are a series of activities and deep debriefing that we do after each one, which is really the hallmark of the virtual reality simulations that the authors will remind us of. And I really got interested in this because my research with interracial interactions, I was thinking like, again, how can we improve it? How can we improve it? Intergroup contact theory says we got to get together. But, interactions between people are often severely limited. This is particularly the case for white people whose home lives, school lives tend to be really segregated. And I begin to think about virtual reality from the research side of my life as being a potential medium for where we can have people engage with different race actors. And some of the experiments that I'm working on and a grant that I have try to see if we can then correlate that to their real world behavior with outgroup members. And so I was thinking about like, how can I start including this in the class? And that's when I began to do, so my work doesn't really focus on embodiment. People are being themselves in interracial interactions, but I've started in the class thinking about some of these embodiment scenarios. And I even let them try some of the ones that we've created in my own lab, because I now do virtual reality research thinking about race relations in VR. And they get to critique mine, which is kind of hard, but, but they get to try out our experiment and, see what it's like to engage in a negative interracial interaction versus a neutral and what that may feel like. And it's been phenomenal. They've really loved it.
Are those VR videos, are some of those available public, like
Yes.
to the public? Yeah.
So some of them are available for free, like with the Oculus or the Vive, are two large companies that do that. Facebook, Oculus, that is. And some of them are proprietary to the researchers, but if they are used, for academic purposes, you can email the researcher and they will send it to you to use it. So that has worked really well. And some are for pay. So we do some, there's one where we think about gender bias. And I think that one costs $15. So they're not extremely expensive, but there are many ways to do it. There are logistical challenges, the cost of the headsets, cleaning the headset in the time of COVID. So I actually have a UV ray light box, series of light boxes where we beam all the nasty germs off between subjects and between class students in the classes, but it works well just wiping them down really well, letting them dry, things like that. So we've had to be really thoughtful about putting this thing on your person with all the oils in your skin and your hair and everywhere else, and but it's begun to work really well. We work closely with the Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning. So for some of my larger classes, they'll sign up with them and sort of cycle through in that way, which the center has loved because the students now have met a new center with resources that they can use, and they have helped us. And this was especially helpful before I owned my own army of headsets to be able to manage all of this. And so, yeah.
How much do you dip into the neuroscience of it? Does that overlap?
Well, neuroscience is hard in VR. It's like more of a burgeoning area from my understanding.
Right. Yeah, that's what I imagine.
Because the problem, when you think about, especially when you think about fMRI, you have to be still, right?
Right.
To do that.
Yeah.
To get the blood flow, all that. In VR, you're often moving quite a lot. Yeah. So more recently, they have newer headsets. I've just heard of one. I don't have it yet. I can't remember the name of it, unfortunately, right now. But I think it's a psychologist has designed a new headset that can track really well a lot of physiological outcomes or behaviors as well. They currently have headsets that can do eye tracking. Rudimentary, not as good as the ones, that are stationary. Eye tracking. So in the research, we look at the visual field, like where people are looking or not looking, sign of avoidance, anxiety.
Whoa.
We map how far they're standing from the other avatars in the space. Again, a sign of approach avoidance, right? We look at the choices that they're making when they're picking things up or refusing to do that. We can randomly assign people to things. And most importantly, for an experimental social psychologist, as myself, things are extremely consistent across every single participant. And so it actually makes it a really great place, I find, to study interracial interactions that actually is more real than even laboratory studies. Because in the lab, people can self-monitor for quite a while. But in VR, when you put on the headset, it's 360 degrees. It literally suspends your reality. And if it's good VR, your sense of presence or really feeling like you're there is improved. And your brain interprets VR interactions in the world identically to the real world.
Wow.
So I've really been excited by it. Now, there are a whole lot of downsides. There are, for every good thing, there are a lot of bad things that people can do with new technology. So we don't have to talk about all that now, but we do talk about it in class. But I've just been excited about the possibilities. We talk about this in class, try out a few, do really good debriefing, and then they, of course, do their posts and reflections to sort of think through and process what we're understanding. And then we connect it to the research and the literature and talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so those are the two activities/assignments that I sort of walked through in my talk, and really wrapped it in thinking about this paradox of interracial interaction research and intergroup contact theory, and how they can comfortably live in the same universe, but we can kind of understand them differently in different contexts and research paradigms, etc.
Well, that's fascinating, and I was right. You made for an awesome interview, so thank
great.
you. Yeah, no, I love hearing about your research, and I already know that we're going to need a part 2 at some point in the future, because you're going to continue to do this stuff, and I'd love to talk to you more about it. And also, often we get into people's like kind of backstory of like what made them this person that wants to do these things. And we got to a little bit of that, but I'd sure love to hear more about that. So Dr. Valerie Jones Taylor, thank you for sitting down with me.
Thank you so much. It's been great.